There are events that announce themselves loudly, that arrive with breaking news alerts and urgent cable traffic, and the kind of imagery that forces attention regardless of prior interest in the subject. And then there are events that do not announce themselves at all, that occur in spaces where the cameras are not pointed, that are processed by local actors without translation into the analytical frameworks that Western commentary uses to make sense of the Middle East, and that consequently pass largely unnoticed by the audiences that most need to understand them. What happened in Damascus last week was the second kind of event, and the fact that it passed largely unnoticed is itself the first thing you need to understand about why it matters. Here is what you need to understand about the Syria analytical problem before we examine what actually occurred. The Western analytical and media ecosystem has a specific way of processing Syria that was shaped by the 2011-2019 period of the Civil War, a framework built around opposition versus government, barrel bombs versus chemical weapons, refugee flows, and humanitarian catastrophe, and the proxy competition between the United States, Russia, Turkey, and Iran. That framework was analytically useful for the period it described, but Syria, in the post-2020 period, is a profoundly different strategic environment, and applying the old framework to the new environment consistently produces misreadings. The Syrian Arab Republic controls the majority of its territory. The major military phase of the civil war is over. What Syria has become is something more complex and more strategically significant, a space where multiple external actors compete for influence, maintain military presence, and use Syrian territory as a logistics and operations environment for activities that extend far beyond Syria itself. Damascus last week was not about the Syrian civil war. It was about something considerably more consequential for the current regional balance. Three developments occurred in close succession that individually each attracted some passing notice. But the analytical failure that needs to be identified is the failure to connect them, to recognize that they constitute a single strategic signal rather than three separate news items. The first development was a shift in the posture of Iranian-linked military formations in the Damascus suburbs, specifically in the belt of territory south and southwest of the capital that has functioned for years as a logistics corridor and base network for Iranian-aligned forces operating in Syria. What changed was not the presence of those formations, they have been there for years, but the specific pattern of movement, consolidation, and facility activity that signals a change in operational readiness rather than routine maintenance. Military intelligence analysts who track force posture recognize the signature of a formation shifting from a steady state presence posture to something closer to an elevated readiness posture. The specific indicators, changes in vehicle dispersal patterns, modifications to command facility configurations, alterations in communication activity, and these are individually ambiguous but collectively significant. The second development was a specific set of meetings in Damascus involving officials whose institutional affiliations placed them at the intersection of Iranian, Syrian, and Lebanese Hezbollah command structures. These meetings were not secret in any meaningful sense. The participants traveled openly, their movements were observable through multiple collection methods, and some of the meetings were acknowledged in oblique terms by Lebanese media that tracks Hezbollah-related developments. What they were was unreported in English language analytical media, which means they passed unprocessed by the audiences that most influence Western policy formation. The third development was a specific infrastructure modification in a facility complex that has been associated with logistics transit, the movement of materiel through Syrian territory toward Lebanon. The modification in question represents an increase in throughput capacity, an engineering change consistent with preparing to move larger volumes through the facility than its previous configuration allowed. Here's what you need to understand about why these three things together constitute a significant strategic signal. Each individual development in isolation has plausible routine explanations. Force posture adjustments happen for many reasons. Officials meet regularly across the Iran-Syria Hezbollah command structures. Infrastructure gets upgraded, but the timing, all three developments occurring within a 10-day window, and the directional coherence, all three pointing in the same direction toward increased operational readiness and logistics capacity, eliminate the routine explanation. When three separate observable developments all point in the same direction at the same time, the most probable explanation is that they reflect a single underlying decision or process rather than three coincidental, unrelated activities. What underlying decision does this cluster of developments most plausibly reflect? The structural analysis points toward preparation for a potential period of elevated tension, not necessarily active conflict, but a period in which Iranian aligned actors in Syria and Lebanon are positioning for the possibility that conditions could change rapidly and that being in a higher readiness state before that change is strategically preferable to scrambling to achieve readiness after it. This is prudent military practice, not evidence of imminent offensive action, but it is also not routine. It reflects a specific assessment made by someone with decision authority over these formations that the near-term environment warrants elevated preparation. What is the trigger for that assessment? Here, the analysis requires working backward from observable behavior to probable cause, which is inherently less certain than forward analysis from known cause to predicted effect. The most consistent explanation is that Israeli military activity in the preceding weeks, specifically the pattern of Israeli airstrikes in Syria that have continued for years as part of Israel's declared campaign to prevent weapons transfers to Hezbollah. Cross crossed a threshold in intensity or target selection that prompted Iranian and Hezbollah planners to reassess their readiness posture. Israeli strikes in Syria have been a recurring feature of the strategic environment since 2013, and for most of that period, Iranian and Hezbollah forces absorbed those strikes without significantly altering their posture. When the posture changes, it suggests that the strikes have either increased in severity or have targeted something specific enough to prompt a strategic response in the form of repositioning. The historical pattern worth examining here is the series of events in 2018 and 2019 when Israeli strikes in Syria became more frequent and more ambitious in target selection, and when that escalation in Israeli activity was followed by a period of significant Iranian repositioning and Hezbollah rearmament that ultimately produced a higher baseline of tension along Israel's northern border. The pattern was Israeli escalation prompts Iranian and Hezbollah repositioning. Repositioning creates new Israeli threat perceptions. New threat perceptions drive further Israeli action. It is a cycle, and cycles have a way of continuing until something breaks them. Either a deterrent success that convinces one side the cost is too high, or an escalation event that breaks the cycle by transforming the underlying situation. Most Western analysts missed what happened in Damascus last week for reasons that are instructive about broader analytical failures. The first reason is language. The most significant signals in the Syria file appear first in Arabic language sources, Lebanese media, Syrian opposition monitoring networks, regional news services that track developments with granular attention because they have local expertise and local sources. Those signals often take days to translate into English language analysis, and by the time they do, the framing has frequently been filtered through interpretive frameworks that strip out strategic significance in favor of more easily communicable narratives. An analyst tracking Arabic language sources would have seen indicators of the Damascus developments within 24 hours. An analyst dependent on English language reporting might still be unaware of them. The second reason is the fragmentation of Syria coverage. In 2015, Syria was the top story in global media and attracted enormous analytical resources. By 2023, the combination of civil war fatigue, the apparent stabilization of the front lines, and the competition for attention from other crises had dramatically reduced the Syria analytical footprint in Western think tanks and media organizations. The analysts who covered Syria at depth have largely moved to other files. What remains is periodic crisis coverage triggered by dramatic events, major Israeli strikes, large casualty incidents, rather than the sustained pattern tracking that strategic signal detection requires. The third reason is the conceptual framework problem identified at the outset. If your mental model of Syria is built around the civil war frame, government versus opposition, humanitarian crisis, refugee flows, then the strategic significance of formation posture changes and logistics facility upgrades in Damascus suburbs does not compute. It does not fit the categories that your analytical framework is built to process. The analysts who missed last week's developments are not incompetent. They are using a framework that was built for a different Syria and has not been updated for the Syria that actually exists today. What are the forward predictions from this analysis? The first prediction is that the posture elevation observed in Damascus will be sustained or intensified over the next 30 to 60 days, during which time Israeli decision makers will need to determine whether to address the repositioning through continued strikes, which risk accelerating the posture elevation, or through other means of signaling that the repositioning has been observed and that its implications are understood. That is not a comfortable choice set. The second prediction is that the logistics throughput increase, if sustained, will produce a measurable change in Hezbollah's operational inventory in Lebanon within 90 to 120 days. What specific systems are being transferred and what operational difference that transfer makes to Hezbollah's threat to northern Israel will be the critical assessment question that Israeli intelligence is currently working to answer. The third prediction is that this episode will eventually be recognized, probably when something more dramatic occurs, and analysts trace back the antecedent signals as a moment when the Syria file required more sustained attention than it was receiving. Strategic surprises almost never emerge from nowhere. They emerge from signals that were visible but unprocessed. Damascus last week was a collection of signals that were visible to anyone looking. The failure was not in the signals, it was in the looking. We will continue to watch this space with the attention that its strategic significance demands. The broader analytical lesson embedded in the Damascus case is worth developing explicitly because it has implications that extend well beyond the Syria file. The failure to track and process the signals that emerged from Damascus last week reflects a systematic weakness in the Western analytical ecosystem. The tendency to allocate analytical resources to the most visible and most dramatically reported aspects of a conflict while underfunding the sustained, granular pattern tracking that strategic signal detection requires. This is not simply a matter of media attention spans or resource constraints, though both of those factors are real. It is a deeper structural problem in how the analytical policy interface is organized. The analysts who would have been most likely to catch the Damascus developments, those with deep Arabic language capability, sustained institutional knowledge of the Syria file, and the kind of relationship networks with local sources that allow early detection, are precisely the analysts whose expertise is most difficult to sustain in institutional environments organized around the news cycle. Deep expertise is slow to develop, requires sustained investment in specific regional and language knowledge, and does not produce the kind of rapid, quotable analysis that the policy consumer in an urgent environment demands. The result is a systematic institutional preference for analytical generalism that is responsive and accessible, but that misses the specific granular signals that constitute genuine early warning. The Damascus case makes this structural problem visible, but it is visible only because subsequent events have forced retrospective attention to antecedent signals. The cases where the signals were missed and the retrospective attention never came because the anticipated development either was averted or occurred below the threshold of attention-forcing impact are invisible by definition. There are almost certainly more of them than the cases we know about. This is the asymmetry of analytical failure. The misses we know about are a small fraction of the actual miss rate because the miss rate is only visible when something sufficiently dramatic occurs to motivate the retrospective search for antecedent signals. The practical implication for anyone attempting to understand the Middle East in real time is that the most important analytical work is also the most institutionally undervalued. Following the Syria file through its quiet periods, when the major combat operations are over, when the humanitarian crises are not generating front-page coverage, when the geopolitical developments require deep local knowledge rather than general regional expertise to detect, is the work that produces genuine strategic early warning. It is the work that would have identified the Damascus signals before they became strategic developments that required response rather than strategic developments that had already occurred. Let me also address the specific challenge that the Damascus case poses for Israeli intelligence collection and assessment. Israel has the most comprehensive and sophisticated collection capability in the region directed at Iranian and Hezbollah activities in Syria. Israeli air operations in Syria, the sustained campaign against Iranian logistics, and Hezbollah weapons transfers are themselves evidence of a collection capability that can identify targets, assess their significance, and authorize kinetic response at an operational tempo that no other regional intelligence service matches. The question raised by the Damascus developments is not whether Israeli collections saw the signals, almost certainly it did. The question is whether those signals generated the analytical assessment and the policy response that they warranted. There is a gap between collection and analysis, and another gap between analysis and policy response that can cause well collected signals to fail to generate appropriate action. Understanding whether those gaps were present in the Israeli processing of the Damascus signals would be analytically significant, but it is not information that is available to outside analysts. What is available is the observable record of Israeli operations in Syria in the period following the developments described here, which will provide indirect evidence about how those developments were assessed and whether they generated a policy response commensurate with their strategic significance. The Syrian government's role in facilitating and managing the Iranian and Hezbollah presence in Syrian territory adds another layer of analytical complexity that is frequently collapsed in Western coverage into a simple patron-client relationship. The Assad government is not simply a passive host for Iranian military activity in Syria. It is an active participant with its own interests and its own agency in managing what happens on Syrian territory. Those interests are not identical to Iranian interests, and the management of the divergences between Syrian and Iranian interests is itself an important dynamic in understanding how the Damascus logistics corridor actually functions. Damascus has specific interests in maintaining the formal appearance of Syrian sovereignty over what happens in Syrian territory, an appearance that matters for the government's relationship with Russia, its interactions with Arab states that are gradually reconsidering their isolation of the Assad government and its domestic legitimacy claims. Those interests sometimes produce friction with Iranian and Hezbollah activities that are conducted in ways that underscore Syrian government dependence rather than sovereign control. Understanding that friction is part of understanding the corridor's actual dynamics, and it is a dimension that the dominant analytical frame, which tends to treat Syria simply as an Iranian-controlled space, consistently obscures. The final element worth adding to the Damascus analytical picture is the Turkish dimension. Turkey maintains military presence in northwestern Syria that is in direct tension with Iranian and Hezbollah positioning in other parts of the country. Turkish-Iranian competition in Syria is not direct military confrontation. Both governments have managed their Syria interests in ways that avoid direct clash, but it is a real strategic competition with specific implications for how Iranian logistics operations can be conducted in the northern parts of the corridor. Turkish intelligence collection on Iranian military activities in Syria is sophisticated and active, and Turkish willingness to share that collection with NATO partners, with Israel, or with Gulf Arab states creates additional constraints on how openly Iranian logistics activity can be conducted in the Turkish observation zone. Factoring the Turkish dimension into the Damascus analysis adds complexity, but also adds accuracy. The Syria strategic environment is not simply an Iranian-American-Israeli triangle. It is a multi-party competition in which Turkish, Russian, and local Syrian actors all have interests and all shape the environment in which Iranian strategy is implemented. The prediction that closes this analysis is appropriately humble about timelines, but confident about direction. The signals observed in Damascus last week will be followed by additional observable developments that will either confirm or complicate the interpretation offered here. The hardened facility construction, if it continues, will become visible to additional collection systems and will generate additional analytical attention, even in the relatively neglected Syria file. The formation posture changes if they reflect a sustained elevation in readiness rather than a temporary adjustment, will produce a sustained observable pattern rather than a brief anomaly. And the combination of all observable developments will either converge into a coherent picture consistent with the interpretation offered here, Iranian-linked forces in Syria elevating their operational readiness in response to a specific assessment of the threat environment, or will diverge in ways that require revision of that interpretation. We commit to following the evidence wherever it leads and to reporting what it says with the precision and the humility that genuine strategic analysis requires. The meta-observation about the Syria file as a whole, its systematic underattention in the Western analytical ecosystem, the analytical framework problem that causes post-Civil War Syria to be processed through Civil War-era categories, the language barrier that delays Arabic language signals from reaching English language analytical audiences deserves one final treatment because it connects to a broader argument about strategic intelligence in the current era. The period of peak information availability in the modern intelligence environment has not produced a corresponding peak in analytical quality. If anything, the proliferation of sources and the acceleration of information flow have created an environment in which the signal to noise ratio has deteriorated, in which the quantity of available information makes the identification and prioritization of genuinely significant signals more rather than less difficult. The Damascus case is a case study in that deterioration. The signals were there, they were theoretically accessible, and they were missed, not because information was lacking, but because the analytical resources and frameworks required to process them into meaningful warning were not applied. Fixing that is not a technology problem. It is an institutional and human expertise problem, and it is a problem that will continue to produce strategic surprises until the institutions responsible for strategic intelligence develop the sustained regional expertise and the analytical patience that early warning genuinely requires. We will continue to watch Damascus with the sustained attention that its strategic significance demands, and we will report what we see with the precision that strategic analysis at this level requires. The signals are there. The task is reading them correctly before they become events rather than after. That is the essential challenge of this analytical work, and it is a challenge we take seriously.